So I would like to introduce Dr. Gigi Matthews now. Gigi is the head of the Obstetrics and Gynecology Unit in CMC Vellore. And I have had the privilege of being under her and also having collaborated with her as a part of an obstetric medicine unit. She has worked in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology for 3 decades, being a principal investigator on multiple research projects, and has been a consultant for WHO guideline development. The moderator for this session is Dr. Santosh Benjamin, who's also professor of obstetrics and gynecology, and his special interest is in high-risk obstetrics and ultrasound. I'll now hand over to Santosh for the rest of the lecture. And thank you, Gigi ma'am, for joining us for this.
Thank you all once again, and thank you, Soumya, for your kind introduction. Without wasting any more time, we'll move on. And it's my honor to hand over to Dr. Gigi Matthews for today's talk about rational obstetric care. And to remember that rational obstetric care at any point is important, so that when you do come to COVID, you realize that with minimal modifications, we'll be able to cope without much change. So I hand over to Prof. Gigi Matthews, and remember, please type your questions in the chat box and we'll address it in the last 15 minutes.
Greetings from the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. At the outset, I'd like to thank the organizers for considering me for this privilege. Now, the hallmark of obstetric care in a not-for-profit organization is easily the large number of women, and a problem especially in COVID times. Interventions, therefore, have to be inexpensive, simple, and not time-consuming. And of course, in low-volume facilities, with some common sense, the management has to be tailored. Now, management has to be pragmatic and evidence-based. Updates of evidence required, but a rider to that would be that the updates that a lot of the evidence is used on interventions is sparse, and therefore you should not discount the experience of large cohorts. The solutions have to be logical, and administrative improvisation always a must. Now, when you look after a large number of women, identifying patients at risk that need urgent attention at the beginning of an antenatal clinic is always good. Efficiency should always be improved with novel ideas. And unlike other specialties, 80% of our patients are low risk. And the care is very standard. And therefore, we should consider group antenatal care and counseling in addition to the care we give. We were happy that this is also being addressed by several research groups. Forming teams to improve efficiency is one mode that we found was very useful. Now, to look at the goal of our antenatal care, COVID or not COVID, would still be to tackle this triad to prevent maternal mortality, morbidity, and all of you would agree with me that postpartum hemorrhage and anemia spectrum, hypertensive spectrum, and sepsis are the key players that cause maternal mortality. So our goal of antenatal care would be to ensure that we tackle these 3 spectrum. Now, anemia spectrum would easily, you would agree with me that preventing anemia and treating anemia would be paramount for antenatal care. Anemia would contribute to the prognosis of postpartum hemorrhage and heart disease, and therefore optimal treatment of anemia, oral iron, deworming, parenteral iron, avoiding blood transfusion, all very important parts of this goal. I'm stressing on this triad is because even during COVID times, we must remember that this is the triad that actually kills women. So COVID, it is COVID and it's different. And we have to take precautions, but we have to be mindful that this triad, the interventions antenatally should always ensure that this triad that actually causes all the distress in women is not neglected. Hypertension spectrum is easily an important aspect of maternal mortality. New onset hypertension that could kill the mother is very identifying such women is absolutely essential, especially in a busy antenatal clinic where people are preoccupied by COVID and the concerns. Identifying women with high blood pressure, new onset hypertension is a challenge. Over the last decade, we have found that automated devices were excellent screening agents to pick up hypertension very early, as soon as they come. Before the doctors are tired, we identify women who have early onset hypertension in the beginning of the clinic, and those are addressed immediately. Women with high blood pressure are identified, and only then a urine albumin is done. This is again to decrease the number of women who have a urine albumin. And though textbooks recommend urine albumin for all women who come to the antenatal clinic, we over the years have tailored this to use urine albumin and weight gain only for women whose blood pressure is increased. There's a lot of interventions that are not highlighted, especially when there's good recent evidence. And one such intervention is the use of calcium, double the dose of calcium to prevent preeclampsia. And this has been identified, unfortunately, not well publicized. There is good evidence to show, and not just a large study, but also a subsequent review that has shown that calcium taken twice a day prevents preeclampsia, and an intervention that has to be advised for all patients. The other new intervention in the last decade is use of ecospirin, 150 milligram in high-risk women with previous early onset hypertension. If I'm addressing obstetricians, you know that we are used to using 75 milligrams of ecospirin. So ecospirin now increased to 150 milligram is what is being mooted, and we should follow this simple intervention. And the third part of this spectrum is sepsis, prevention of sepsis. So sepsis, the common causes for sepsis antenatally is pyelonephritis, but easily puerperal sepsis resulting from chorioamnionitis or just puerperal with the placental bed being an easy access to multiple organisms, being a very important reason why puerperal sepsis is so important. And of course, there are other infections like tetanus, which occasionally still occur, especially in the north of the country where women still don't have tetanus injections, group B beta hemolytic streptococcus, torch infections, and influenza-like infection. Now, I don't know if all of you now know that we've moved on. The government has very kindly supplied us with TD, which is quite inexpensive. Because of the resurgence of diphtheria and pertussis, in addition to tetanus, there is a recommendation for use of Tdap. But then Tdap would be expensive. It would cost about 1,500, and therefore, if you are catering to women who are economically advantaged and would want this, we should offer Tdap. Now, the problem with group B beta hemolytic streptococcus is that the incidence is variable. We're not sure. So therefore, investigating group B beta hemolytic streptococcus would definitely be a challenge. Torch infections are rare, and so we don't routinely look for rubella and torch. And influenza-like illness, we'll be alluding to this later in the lecture. So the triad for maternal mortality, then looking at fetal and neonatal morbidity and mortality, IUGR, prematurity, diabetes, congenital anomalies would easily be the reasons for, easily be the goals for antenatal care, prevention of IUGR, related complications of abruptio placentae and stillbirth. We would, most of you would know that hypertension, multiple pregnancy, medical complications complicating pregnancy result in IUGR. So when there's a background risk, it's easy. It's good to diagnose IUGR. One of the concerns of IUGR, diagnosing IUGR, is that often it's just a constitutionally small baby. So unless there's a background risk, the diagnosis of IUGR becomes tricky. The next goal for antenatal care would be prematurity. And fortunately, in our parts, we still have only about 5 to 10%. And preventing prematurity in the first pregnancy is a challenge, and it is not often done in not-for-profit organization. You are aware now that there's an epidemic of diabetes. Gestational diabetes is seen in almost 30% of our women. So identifying them and treating them optimally, ensuring good glycemic control would definitely prevent the adverse outcomes in the neonate. Congenital anomalies are seen only in 3% of our women. So with this background, to achieve these goals, history should cover areas that will impact management. And in a busy antenatal clinic, we have to train good clinical assistants to be part of a team that can improve efficiency and identify women quickly with very little exposure in the clinic. So obviously, the first visit would be very important. We all know that dating a pregnancy is the most important goal of this management, and we would want a senior member forming the team, especially senior member in the team, to be involved with dating the pregnancy in the first visit. Often in places like in the north, unlike our place where all our women come very early in pregnancy, dating a pregnancy is quite a challenge. Now, making a plan for the pregnancy is paramount in the first visit, so that subsequently even a junior doctor can continue seeing this pregnancy. Forming teams with a senior has been especially important during COVID times. We also had teams where one member of the team wore basic PPE and everybody didn't need to wear elaborate PPE. Now, PPE, when we started COVID infection 6 months ago, we were perplexed on how we were going to prevent infection. Fortunately, there were a lot of ideas, and we came up with a simple idea. We had teams using just a gown from a delivery bundle, and later on we realized the most important component of PPE was the N95 mask and the visor. Everything else kind of gave us a reassurance that we were protecting ourselves and protecting the patient, but actually it was the N95 mask that played the most important role. I'm stressing on this because as caregivers in a developing country, in a non-for-profit organization, this seemed to be an important aspect of our care. The other important aspect was preventing crowding. Now, how did we prevent crowding? We came up with a very good idea. We didn't let the patient's relatives enter the clinic. Patients' relatives were allowed to come in only when there was need for extraordinary counseling. And that actually made the waiting areas in our antenatal clinics extremely congenial for patient care, and we ensured that adequate social distancing with this small intervention. We also ensured that the patient did not spend more than 10 minutes with all the interventions that I mentioned earlier, team systems, having a clinical assistant who quickly took the history, etc. We ensured that the patient spent very little time in the room. Now, our experience in the scan room, we have a scan room is a closed room, an air-conditioned room with which had an exhaust put in. We've had almost 1,000 women going through morphology scans for 30 minutes each month, and we've had 4 of our technicians sitting in the room with basic PPE, N95 masks, and it's 6 months, and none of them have actually acquired COVID infection. So the other important part of our management in the antenatal clinic was triaging. I'm mentioning this because one of the greatest concerns in these busy antenatal clinics is the worry that we were providing an environment not congenial for antenatal care. Now, frequency of visits and goals had to be targeted. Obviously, during COVID times, we tried to decrease the number of visits depending on low risk and high risk. And the low risk ones obviously had targeted screening. In the first trimester, we ensured that the dating was optimum. Those of you who are obstetricians here would know that the gold standard for dating a pregnancy would be a first trimester scan. But we also know that most of our women do not turn up in the first trimester, and we need to improvise and find ways of finding the best gestational age. The second goal of antenatal care would be to rule out anomalies. As I mentioned before, 3% of our women have congenital anomalies, and we end up doing an anomaly scan at the 20th week. And the third trimester would be essentially to look at growth and to screen for diabetes. High-risk patients also during COVID times were individualized, and we tried to decrease the number of visits. Triaging women, especially symptomatic women, and seeing them separately if they were in the high prevalence area was another intervention that really helped. Investigations in the not-for-profit organization of a developing country still remain simple. Hemoglobin, you would agree with me, this is the most important investigation, ensuring that the patient does not have anemia. There's anemia treatment, prophylaxis, and prevention of anemia, and therefore hemoglobin, we always ensure that the patient has this basic investigation. VDRL HIV and HPS-AG are essentially done to ensure that the baby has the best possible treatment. And urine microscopy would rule out sepsis. We know that asymptomatic bacteriuria is one condition, pregnancy is one condition where you would definitely treat asymptomatic bacteriuria to prevent pyelonephritis. And now that gestational diabetes is seen in almost 20 to 30% of our women, 75 gram oral glucose tolerance test is checked between 24 and 28 weeks. Now, I would also like to mention non-mandatory investigations, because we know that group B beta hemolytic streptococci has been mooted as a cause for neonatal morbidity and mortality. Having said that, we always look at number needed to treat when we choose our investigations. And these two investigations so far combine screening for Downs, TSH, rubella, cervical length or vaginal ultrasound are still not part of our must-do list. And as we go on, I will stress on why this is the case. We are also, as a developing country, healthcare workers in the developing country, it is always important to refer to WHO guidelines, because WHO is mindful of care in the developing country being economically viable, and therefore looking up WHO guidelines is also a must when we do antenatal care. Again, I reiterate, number needed to treat is always important to decide on the mandatory investigations. Ultrasound. In developing countries, ultrasound is misused. First, patients' perception is extremely wrong. They think ultrasound is the panacea for all problems in antenatal in the antenatal period, which we know is not. A dishonest or usually an ill-informed doctor would use this to his or her advantage and to the patient's disadvantage. Now, why do I say the use of ultrasound has to be carefully done? Because we've worried about the false positive rate especially of the third trimester ultrasound. Ultrasound to date a pregnancy is a definite reason for use. Ultrasound to rule out major anomalies, I would still agree, it has a place, because you pick up those 3% of pregnancies where the pregnancy needn't unnecessarily go on till term. Growth scan, there is a problem with using of growth scan because we are concerned about the constitutionally small baby, and therefore growth scan only when clinically using growth scans only when you clinically suspect a growth restriction, or when there's a background risk of a condition where you worry about the growth of the baby. That is when growth scans are actually most useful. Otherwise, you end up only adding more concern and unnecessary intervening when not required. Placental localization and twin pregnancy are other times when you definitely need to use an ultrasound. Now, when I talk about false positive, non-stress test that has been used widely by obstetrician has resulted in a lot of false positive diagnosis of abnormality in the pregnancy, resulting in unnecessary induction, and that is something we should be wary of. Now, a note about morphology scans. An audit of 28,000 scans in 2 years correctly showed, like all literature describes, that 963 major anomalies could be diagnosed. And most of them were renal pelvic abnormality, which had good prognosis. And the commonest was CNS anomalies, which were easily identified. Anomalies that were difficult to identify were only less than 0.2%, and a 4-chamber view picks up major anomalies of the heart incompatible with life. So therefore, a morphology, we should not shy away from doing a simple morphology scan, even in your mission hospital. Now, I said group counseling, very important in our busy antenatal clinics of a not-for-profit organization, where in HIV, the screening would be an opt-out method. And in down screening, where a lot of our patients don't even know what down screening is, you must offer them elaborate screening, elaborate group counseling, where they then opt in to have a screening, and they should know what they're in for when you offer them down screening. Treatment, as I mentioned before, please give them calcium twice a day to prevent PIH. Iron, of course, has to be given. There is, it has to be, and TD can replace TT. You can offer flu vaccine to women who can afford vaccines. And the other thing that you should know is that we never give live vaccines in pregnancy. both varicella and rubella is not given. In the West, they look for rubella titer in pregnancy only to make sure that at discharge, the woman is given a rubella vaccine if she does not have the antibody. But we don't do that in our setup. Now, identifying women who need additional treatment is also an important goal, because we know that all our women would definitely need calcium and iron, and they need their tetanus toxoid injection. Now, tetanus and diphtheria, we don't give the expensive Tdap, but we offer it to them. But a goal is to identify those women who will definitely benefit with 150 milligrams of ecospirin, those who are likely to develop early onset preeclampsia, women who would benefit with progesterone, that is, women who have had a pregnancy with a preterm pregnancy in the past. And the third, of course, would be looking at cervical length only if the woman had a history suggestive of cervical incompetence or previous preterm pregnancy, and offering a stitch. So identifying women who need additional treatment would definitely be a goal of antenatal care. Now, with looking at cervical length, we know that when the cervix is short, they're more likely to go into labor. But in our setup, where this is done with a vaginal ultrasound, it is still not cost effective to be offering cervical length screening for all antenatal women. We also know that cervical stitch is not useful for twins, and therefore high-risk twins like those who've had infertility treatment could be given prophylactic progesterone. Now, the summary of antenatal care during COVID times is efficiency, quick assessment of women, identifying women at risk needing immediate attention at the beginning of an antenatal clinic, identifying women with a background risk so that you can closely look for IUGR, avoid investigations that have high positivity, and these continue even during COVID times. Now, going to intrapartum care, we would all agree that if stillbirth rates, early neonatal rates, asphyxial rates are sensitive measures of the quality of care of intrapartum care. Now, respectful maternity care, even during COVID times, is a must for good quality intrapartum care. It's always important to upgrade protocols, ensure that you're doing practicing evidence-based medicine, but all the time in a not-for-profit large organization in a developing country, we must remember that logistics, pragmatic alterations, especially during COVID time, all have a role. Now, the best ideal management would be an experienced healthcare worker, 1:1 ratio between a healthcare worker and a patient. Pulse taken every 30 minutes, BP every hour to 4 hours, partograph maintained, high-risk patients closely monitored. But confidential inquiries have shown that all the mishaps in the labor room have been in low-risk women. And therefore, following this ideal management is almost impossible in a not-for-profit organization of a developing country. So we've actually worked on a bundle, intrapartum care bundle, which covered obstetric interventions and improvisation, human resources, audit and training, and infrastructure, some of which we've followed and some are ideas that would help others. So obviously in a high volume labor room where you want to have very good results, you have to improvise and you use obstetric intervention and improvise optimally. We know that ambulation, hydration, delayed rupture of membranes, partograph only after 6 centimeters is all now being mooted. But ambulation not necessarily possible in a large hospital with a high turnover. Delayed rupture of membranes, perfect in a small mission hospital, not always possible in a high turnover tertiary center, because the delaying rupture of membranes would increase the duration of labor by 1 to 2 hours, and that would be crucial in a high volume labor room. I must mention that I must reiterate that currently the partograph is marked from 6 centimeters, and you allow about 6 to 8 hours for the woman to deliver vaginally. Having said that, we all know that the partograph is marked retrospectively. Now, the hallmark of good monitoring in the labor room would be optimal fetal heart monitoring. And optimal fetal heart monitoring in a developing countries by intermittent monitoring is almost impossible. And therefore, we in our main hospital have shifted to continuous fetal heart monitoring, though it is not evidence-based medicine. This is basically to overcome the shortage of experienced staff and to ensure reliability and accountability. We have improvised and started monitoring every labor continuously with monitors, and this is expensive. Therefore, there's a role for cheap, inexpensive fetal heart monitors with visual display of fetal heart. And this, I know as we speak, there are innovators looking at different ways of monitoring fetal heart. Electronic partograph with a NAG feature would overcome the retrospective filling of partograph, which we think would definitely make a change in the way we monitor labors. The vaginal, as I said, intervention, it would be great to allow every patient who's had a cesarean section to deliver normally. But we know that it's impossible. The kind of stress the laboring unit undergoes when there are a couple of patients with a scar on their uterus definitely has an impact on the way the others in the labor ward are taken care of. So we have had to improvise, and when at any given time, if there were more than 2 women with attempting a VBAC, we then allow the women who are most unlikely to deliver vaginally to have an elective list. So elective lists actually allowing the woman to make a choice has definitely made an impact on the way we function. And this elective list has been a boon during COVID times, where you electively kind of check them out for COVID infection, and then operate and the surgery is done in a different theater. Now, human resources, the other challenge of staffing in a labor ward, like an ICU, you need 24-hour cover, and accessibility of experienced staff 24/7 is quite a challenge. The market forces, registrars of third calls take the expertise with them. Large tertiary centers are always training registrars and third calls. Now, some solutions to these challenges would be to ensure that your junior level staff have shift system, they're well rested, post duty off for senior cover, so that there is no burnout, experience and expertise to remain with the facility. So this doctor is not really indispensable, because you have paramedical and nurses who are used to doing night shift, empowered. When I say empowered, I'm not saying that they should be taught to apply instruments, but I'm saying that core principles such as prerequisites for applying an instrument, if taught to nurses and paramedical staff, and like in the north where you have theatre babus assisting in cesarean section, that goes a long way to make sure your facility is empowered and you're not dependent on just doctors who may not stay on. So the other important thing is human resources, about human resources, that You have to address staff insecurity, and this has to be addressed to ensure respectful maternity care. Women are in labor, are in pain, and we know that this is an area which has in the last decade been given the attention it needed to give, needed to be given. And a birth companion now, or a doula, is a must in all labors, and we ensure this even during COVID times. Team support to the person in charge is vital to ensure optimal intrapartum care. Now, the third major component of this bundle was the audit training cycle. It was useful to have this no blaming, naming, or shaming, to have another department overseeing our performance, outcomes more important than the process. And this is the third important role, a part of our attempts to improve quality in our labor room. The audits of cesarean section, especially during COVID, we've reiterated that COVID, at cesarean, there's less exposure both to the health worker and to the patient, especially because most of our cesareans are done under spinal anesthesia. So PPE was easy. The N95 mask and the necessary basic PPE was used for all cesarean sections. Generally, we've said that clinical privilege should be enabling and not disabling, especially in the tertiary center, where we train people to go out into the periphery and they are then made to do difficult surgeries. So clinical privilege should be enabling. And audits of cesarean, though we have asphyxial rates as good as any developed country in the world, we still struggle to decrease our cesarean section rates. And obviously, when you have such high standards of low asphyxia, then your cesarean section rates kind of climb up. And this is something which is still a challenge. And induction of labor is a culprit that definitely contributes to increasing the cesarean section rate. Now, all of you should look out for something called the Robson's classification, which seems to have a lot of which will definitely play a major role in auditing our cesarean sections. It is not within the ambit of this talk, but I would request you to all look up Robson's classification for more clarity. This is an evolving, we still don't know the gold standard in our setup in different facilities, and we should be working on this in future. So the fourth important point of any labor ward for optimal intrapartum care is the basic infrastructure. I'm not talking about expensive infrastructure. Basic infrastructure that is ensuring that there is enough mobility between beds, that you have infusion monitors monitoring your oxytocin delivery to ensure that you don't cause problems. Simple railings, because privacy is a major role during deliveries. So low-cost CTG machine, drip monitors, curtain railings to improve. So you can see our labor room, which is very, very busy, that has about 30 to 40 deliveries per day. We have simple curtain railings that have improved efficiency. We have drip monitors. So a simple bed in a not-for-profit organization should look something like this. It should have a drip monitor, inexpensive fetal heart monitoring system, and there should be enough place around the bed for the caregivers to give optimum care. Now, looking after our women, it was quite a challenge. We were lucky because we had another block which was not underutilized, and therefore we triaged women at the admission site, symptomatic women and women from high COVID areas were triaged to another area. And because we had optimal staffing, we managed to manage a separate labor room for COVID. Now this, obviously, it was not the best way of managing, but given our circumstances, we improvised and did what we could. Now, use of CTG now suddenly was very useful for us because that decreased the time spent by the health worker with a positive woman. Caregiver wearing PPE and the patient, ensuring the patient was wearing an N95 mask, companion wearing a PPE was some of the interventions that we ensured. We are not allowing breastfeeding. However, having said that, in a developing country where diarrhea is such an issue, we should still allow breastfeeding with optimal improvising, using novel ways of ensuring that that there's limited exposure of the baby to the positive mother. Telephonic support was allowed, and therefore we also we use telephonic support to the relatives of a laboring lady. Now, timing of delivery, is to ensure the obstetric optimal care. Postpartum period is a very, very, very important time because a lot of the maternal deaths occur during this time, and there is no center where the time of delivery, no matter how poorly the obstetric, how poorly managed the facility is, timing of delivery is always known. And therefore, this principle of the golden hour is very, very important. COVID or no COVID, golden hour, very important. By the end of an hour, the mother and the baby should be together, the mother feeding the baby, ideally with the mother comfortable. The moment you find the mother is not settled, she's continuing to bleed, that is the time to intervene. And that is one way of ensuring that ensuring decrease in postnatal complications in the mother. Ensuring that the uterus is below the umbilicus is also the second important thing. And using misoprostol in our country where temperatures are usually high, misoprostol is stable in room temperature, and we should use misoprostol. Ensuring the uterus is below the umbilicus after delivery is another simple method to ensure that we don't have complications. And I wouldn't go into details of postpartum care. I'm sure all of you know, and you're very good at it. Early diagnosis of sepsis is vital. Fever, tachycardia. And I must say that we've had some rare bladder ruptures, which I would advise you to look out for, especially women who don't tell you that they haven't been voiding optimally. But it's not, again, within the ambit of this lecture. I could clarify what this is later on. Breast abscess, you must know that the patient never has breast abscess before discharge. Breast abscess is seen only after they go home. So you have to warn them. Now, during COVID time, you would know that respiratory infections, we've had respiratory infections in pregnancy, and the prognosis actually has been quite bad. The other respiratory infections are seen in 5% of pregnancy, and there were almost 25% mortality. Vertical transmission is not seen. Unlike other respiratory infection, though COVID is seen in almost 10% of pregnancy, 2/3 of these pregnancies were actually asymptomatic. They only, and very few required level 2 care. There are reports of increased miscarriage, placental insufficiency. Some say there's vertical transmission, but there's not enough information as of now to change the way we monitor these women. Now, treatment is very similar to a non-pregnant patient. We would still use dexamethasone, remdesivir. Thromboprophylaxis is only in high-risk women. And finally, an overview of obstetric care in CMC in COVID times. I think the multidisciplinary approach, with everybody giving in, putting in their input, coming up with solutions for problems, was what actually helped us. 6 to 10 months, we had about 400 positive pregnant women. Perinatal outcomes were not very different. We had about 17% of preterm delivery, 4% of stillbirth, which is not 17% of preterm is slightly higher than what you would see in other in a in pregnancies and non-COVID times. But the stillbirth was very similar to the non-COVID time. There was definite increased cesarean section rate because the threshold to post for cesarean section, only due to the difficulties in the logistics, ensuring the patient reached on time, the time taken for the caregiver to use a PPE, etc., so there was a lower to the threshold to do cesarean section rates. Stray incidents of near miss due to logistic issues were there even in our center. I must reiterate, improvisation is a must and has to be replaced by can. You have to find solution for the available human resources and other resources in the limited resources. And the team contributes to solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for that insightful talk into national obstetric care, which can be used in COVID times and other times. So we've got one of the questions that was asked was this down screening routine care for all patients.
Yeah. Down screening should not be routine care for all patients. Patients should be counseled. Now we have excellent screening for Down syndrome. It is done at 11 to 13 weeks. Screening is done between 11 and 13 weeks, and high-risk patients are identified. The moment they are high risk, they have a definitive test, which is non-invasive prenatal testing or chorion villus biopsy. But I would reiterate, down screening in a developing country should not be an opt-out test. It should be an opt-in test. Patients should be counseled, and economically advantaged patients obviously may offer it. You should try and ensure that you can offer this screening test.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay, so there's another question. What changes should be made in waiting rooms of labor room triage and antenatal clinic for large crowds?
Okay. As I mentioned to you, decreasing the crowd was an essential part of our triaging system. We made sure only the patient was allowed, and only in circumstances when the patient needed extraordinary counseling, the relatives were allowed into the clinic, and that made it so much easier for us. Did that answer our question? We also triaged the patient at the entrance of the hospital, where they were the patients from high prevalence areas were sent to another area but these are interventions that are not always possible. Ensuring that everybody wears a good N95 mask, social distancing are definite things that we should ensure at all times.
There's a question, ma'am, about whether we had any mortality as a result of COVID, maternal mortality.
Yeah, actually, Dr. Soumya will be a good person to answer that. I think there were no mothers that died because of COVID. I'll let Dr. Soumya address that question.
Thank you, ma'am. We've just been looking after people who were medically ill with COVID-19, including the pregnant woman. We've had no mortality so far. We've had people both postpartum and in the antenatal period being infected with COVID and becoming seriously ill. But the number of people who became ill, as ma'am mentioned, was very few. So no mortalities, fortunately, by God's grace.
If the mother is infected with COVID in the first trimester, is there any evidence of congenital abnormalities in the fetus?
These are early days. We don't have good evidence, but we think not, and we allow the pregnancy to continue like a normal pregnancy. I alluded to that in my talk. We've said the early days, we still don't know. Good case control studies will eventually give us some ideas in the future.
Sticking with infections, another question related to high mortality rate of women with acute respiratory infection in pregnancy associated with HIV? What are the outcomes of HIV positive mothers and COVID?
Thing is, we have very little HIV now, and so that's going to be something very, very rare. So we would have no experience with this. We don't have enough experience with COVID pregnancies, leave alone HIV infected pregnancies.
How was the communication with relatives and taking consent from patients handled for COVID positive patients?
How was coming?
How did they take consent?
See, a lot of the consenting was done telephonically. We used the telephone. In fact, neonatology was doing a lot of counseling on the telephone. The obstetrician wore PPE. The obstetrician looking after the patient did a lot of the consenting directly. But the neonatologists who didn't need to be there for the counseling used telephonic counseling optimally.
Was there a need to terminate any pregnancy as a result of COVID because the mother's condition was worsening?
Yeah, so I know that Dr. Soumya and team managed one such pregnancy, but generally we did not terminate pregnancies. These are also anecdotal cases, so I would think that we should individualize each case. Generally, we did not terminate pregnancy if there was no respiratory embarrassment. We decided we wouldn't terminate pregnancy if there was no additional risk to the pregnancy, if there was no additional respiratory embarrassment because of a large uterus. And I'm sure Soumya can add something to this.
Fortunately, we had postpartum, and the ones who were antenatal were not towards the towards delivering or to the end of the third trimester. So we actually managed to kind of just continue pregnancy for those who needed to. And I think in influenza, we've terminated more pregnancies than we did in COVID, that being obviously more common and more harmful with a lot of morbidity to the mother. But fortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has not brought us to that situation.
Yeah. As a principle, in pregnancy, when you intubate a patient, you would want that uterus to be less than 28 weeks. So if the uterus is 32 to 34 weeks, in the past, when we've had other influenza-like illness, we've always emptied the uterus for optimal ventilation.
Ma'am, I just want to add that, sorry, can I just add one thing, that even with the non-pregnant individuals, the non-invasive ventilation has proved to be very efficacious for COVID-19 pneumonias. And fortunately, we were able to just do that much, even with the patient being pregnant towards early third trimester.
A question from one of the mission hospitals about a lot of women coming to the labor room even now with fever. How would we manage them?
I think you must ensure that they are triaged to a separate place. You have to have their COVID tested, and they have to be managed in a separate place, considered as COVID positive.
There are no more questions. I'd like to thank Dr. Gigi and Dr. Santosh for sharing these insights, both because I think the COVID-19 pandemic didn't change the number of patients coming for obstetric care. In fact, it increased it because a lot of local hospitals couldn't cope with the situation of the pandemic, and I think their numbers actually went up. And they were actually the most functional unit in the hospital through the pandemic and beyond. And it has not been easy because as per our obstetric department and institution, we don't turn away anybody who comes for need, be it in labor, pregnant or not. So I think I would also like to put in that special word that the obstetric unit worked through the pandemic, not just with their normal numbers, but sometimes even higher than normal numbers. And along with all of the protocols that ma'am mentioned, I think they were able to do a really good, I think facilitate care for people even through the pandemic. Santosh, there's one more question. Do you want to just
I
see
think
there's
I think it's a comment. It's a continuation of the women who come in fever and labor. They had somebody
arrest?
who desaturated on post-op day
Post-op
3
day
and
3.
had an arrest, which is unfortunate. Um, Meaning we thankfully haven't had too many patients
Have that.
deteriorate that quickly. Should. But again, like Thomas said, I want to thank all the participants for taking time out of their busy schedules to attend and ask relevant questions. And we hope that that the talk has given you additional reason to be rational with your care and to continue to do what you're doing so well already. Thank you.
So thank you all for your patient listening. Any other queries can be sent in by mail. I'm sure we would like to help you in any way we can. And thank you again. And we hope that we can continue to interact in the same way. And please look forward to our notices about the next Pulse lecture. Okay, thank you everybody. And we'll say bye now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.